The United States finally started to consider defending its holdings of distant islands and atolls in the late 1930s, as war clouds rolled in over the wide Pacific Ocean. In the Philippines, Guam, Midway, Wake, and particularly in Hawaii, the new home of the Pacific Fleet, civilian contractors were used to construct runways, port facilities, barracks, fuel dumps, water towers, and defenses. After the hard early years of the Depression, the high-paying employment were especially appreciated by the civilian personnel. Military strategists were aware of their vulnerability in the event of conflict. Armed civilians could be regarded as guerrilla fighters under the rules of war and legally killed by the enemy. The idea of establishing a building corps within the Navy, akin to the Army Corps of Engineers, was discussed in the tiny circles of the Washington military elite. However, not much was done before to December 1941. In July 1941, the United States took over the task of defending Iceland in the Atlantic to help the struggling British. Civilian construction workers were called upon to strengthen the island's port infrastructure and defenses. Fearing the lethal U-boats, the bitterly cold weather, and the unfriendly locals, many seasoned construction workers turned down the opportunity. To fill the vacancy, the Navy turned to Admiral Ben Moriel, Chief of the Bureau of Yards and Docks, BUDOCS. He authorized 5 companies of 99 men each. About 200 seasoned construction engineers and laborers, many of whom had served in World War I, had enlisted in the construction brigades by December 7, 1941. However, they never made it to Iceland. Civilian construction workers suffered greatly when war broke out. Following the fall of Wake Island, over 1,000 civilian workers who had surrendered were sent below deck in small Japanese prisoner ships to work in squalid labor camps under worsening conditions for the remainder of the war. Another 100 were held behind on Wake to do construction work for their new owners. Unfortunately, they were all ruthlessly killed in 1943 when Wake was shut off from Japan and there was not much food left on the island. In the Philippines and on Guam, civilian laborers also suffered. It was obvious that construction personnel needed to be able to protect their projects and themselves. In order to support the battle in the Atlantic and train the new naval construction battalions, the Navy purchased land at Quonset Point, close to Davisville, Rhode Island, as early as February 1942. To fulfill the same purpose in the Pacific, another facility was built in Port Hueneme, California. A third new base was built at Gulfport, Mississippi, to support operations in the Caribbean. 3 battalions in a single regiment-sized force was the original intention. These naval construction battalions, or Seabees, soon adopted the official moniker of Seabees. Following some discussion, the Civil Engineering Corps was given command of the Seabee program. The same Admiral Moriel, a qualified civil engineer who had already started hiring construction workers for Iceland, was given overall command. His men would soon refer to him as the King Bee because he was an early supporter of the NCBs. In order to recruit personnel from the building trades, Moriel increased his efforts. Foremen and supervisors were recruited as petty officers, while construction engineers would be promoted to commissioned officers. Fortunately, the New Deal employment programs created during the Depression had taught many of the early Seabees their trade skills. The National Youth Administration, NYA, one of these initiatives, kept providing assistance. Across the nation, the NYA had constructed abandoned youth camps. These were made available to the Seabees so that they could quickly transport the new recruits off to the South Pacific after assembling, orienting, outfitting, inoculating, and providing basic physical conditioning. Prior to the construction of the Seabees' own camps, some of these were used. Moriel assured the labor unions that the Seabees would only operate abroad unless there were national emergencies, to allay their concerns that they would be competing with them. Approximately 80% of the first Seabees were union members. For the Seabees, construction was just one aspect of their work. They received training in military tactics and the usage of small guns, because they were also expected to perform combat duties. They were supposed to drop their tools and grab their rifles when conflict arose. As a result, the Seabees' slogan, Construimus Batuimus, which translates to "We build" was created. "We fight." "Can do" became their motto. At about the same time, the Seabees' recognizable logo was designed. It showed a bee in a Navy hat with a wrench, hammer, and Tommy gun in its hands. Another 100 raw recruits joined the 200 soldiers who had been recruited to labor in Iceland before the bases could be finished, or the chain of command set up. After completing 3 short weeks of basic training, they joined 4,000 regular U.S. soldiers on board a ship in January 1942, soldiers from the 13th Coast Artillery of the Army. On February 17, 1942, their convoy landed at the French island of Bora Bora, after making 2 stops to transfer supplies and equipment into 5 transport ships. For the remainder of the war, the just-arrived Seabees were referred to as the 1st Construction Battalion Detachment, or the Bobcats, after the naval code name for Bora Bora. Their task was to build a significant air and sea refueling facility for warships in order to maintain Australia's access to critical maritime lanes. The Bobcats had nothing to begin with. The bottom of the supply ship holds held their moving and building equipment. Although cargo could be loaded onto barges by ship cranes, unloading the barges had to be done by hand once they arrived at shore. Everything else on the ships was buried beneath the earth movers, bulldozers, and cranes on land. Therefore, it was necessary to manually hoist 8 7-inch, 13-ton naval cannons intended for the island's defense into position. On Bora Bora, several of these weapons are still in use today. The 5 transports and the 3 more ships that came shortly after would take 52 days to fully unload. The men suffered from tropical illnesses that weakened them. A few contracted the hideous elephantiasis. Their meals mostly came from dubious-looking tins. They had to construct their own rudimentary facilities while enduring constant rain and dirt. In 3 weeks, the Bobcats were able to erect 300 Quonset shelters in spite of all the challenges. They constructed a power plant, docks, an airfield, and the crucial fuel tanks. The 4,000 Army soldiers stepped in to help meet the Navy's deadline for the fuel tanks, while the laborers ashore put in long hours assembling and positioning the holding tanks. Tankers brought in fuel, just in time to refuel the ships and aircraft that participated in the crucial Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942. The refueling station was operational. Without refueling at Bora Bora, the Navy would not have been able to fight in the Coral Sea. The activity of the Seabees astonished and confused the adversary for the first time, but it won't be the last. The unsung heroes of that war were them and their Army allies. Work had been difficult, and tempers had occasionally erupted. His men smelled like goats, lived like dogs, and worked like horses, according to a later letter from their leader. At Bora Bora, important logistics lessons were acquired. Wheelbarrows without wheels had been given to the Bobcats. The welding equipment did not come with safety masks, and their trucks did not have enough spare parts. The Seabees started loading and unloading the supply ships by themselves, after learning that civilians had loaded the transports that had caused so much problems. The items being sent, and the sequence in which supplies and equipment were required ashore, were carefully considered. Because of their excellent performance, the Navy assigned them the responsibility of loading and unloading all supply ships. While physical fitness requirements were loosened, Seabee recruiters in the U.S. still sought out individuals with construction experience. As a result, early enlistees were about 37 years old. However, some men in their 60s joined as well. The first NCB sailed to the islands of Leyte in the New Hebrides and Tonga Tabou in the Tonga Group in March. The second NCB reached Samoa in May. The fifth sent detachments to Midway, Palmyra, Johnston Island, and French frigate Shoals, the fourth to Alaska, and the third NCB to Fiji and Noumea in New Caledonia. The Seabees started encircling the Japanese Pacific Ocean Empire with a network of outposts. On May 4th, a detachment of the 1st NCB arrived on Leyte to discover a small team of Army engineers and Marines attempting to construct an airport. The soldiers and Marines were thrilled to see the newcomers and gave the Seabees special recognition for their leadership. In order to finish the airstrip in time for the arrival of 20 planes on May 28th, all 3 parties combined their resources and equipment. At Leyte, Building a hospital with 600 beds was a top goal. Until we had the hospital ready, we couldn't launch a land offensive. The hospital would treat 900 wounded troops during the height of the battle for Guadalcanal, according to Lieutenant Samuel Mathis of the 1st Battalion. On June 1st, consolidated PBY Catalina flying boats from Leyte launched the first bombs on the Japanese airport being built on Guadalcanal, thanks to the Seabees building of a seaplane ramp, in addition to their other duties. However, Guadalcanal was 1,400 miles away, making it impossible to bomb effectively from that distance. The Seabees were instructed to travel 200 miles north to Espiritu Santo. On July 8, 1942, we arrived at Espiritu Santo, Lieutenant Commander Matisse said. They set up generators and floodlights right once so they could operate all night, because there was nothing but bush there. They constructed barracks, hospitals, fuel tanks, and airfields while working non-stop. By doing this, they reduced the bombing range of Guadalcanal. On July 28th, the first fighter aircraft arrived, followed the following day by the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress bombers. The first to come under fire was the 6th NCB. The Japanese had quickly fled the unfinished, muddy, undrained, and unpaved runway when the Marines landed on Guadalcanal on August 7, 1942. Bombs and shells left deep ruts on the airport, and mishaps in the tumultuous mud claimed more planes than battle. It was still too early to spare many Marines to work on the airstrip. They required operational airfields to survive on the disputed island. Get the Seabees to come. To inspect the incomplete field, 6th NCB Commander Lieutenant CMDR Paul Blunden, CEC, USNR, traveled to Guadalcanal in a PBY on August 20th. He summoned the commander of the 1st Marine Division, Maji Sitz Alexander A. Vandegrift, right away. Vandegrift was excited for the outcome, but less so for having additional mouths to feed when Blunden asserted that the Seabees could build an all-weather paved airfield. Shipping to bring in personnel and construction equipment was problematic, and his food supplies were finite and running low. Only half of the battalion will serve in Guadalcanal until supply constraints were addressed, according to a compromise. 357 men from Companies A and B of the 6th Battalion, together with 5 officers, arrived on the island on September 1st. The Seabees, who wore a hybrid uniform containing elements of the Army, Navy, and Marines, were viewed with disdain by the Marines. Some of them were old enough to be their dads. However, the newcomers quickly demonstrated their value. The Seabees proceeded to work following a difficult first night on open ground. After resolving the drainage issue, they would level, extend, and broaden the airstrip, which the Marines christened Henderson Field in honor of Major Lofton Henderson, who lost his life at the Battle of Midway. Additionally, 2 fighter plane support fields would be constructed. Before all 1,000 members of the 6th NCB were ashore, it would be mid-October. It was our job to keep the holes filled up while we finished the grading, laid Marston mat, built hard stands and revetments, and helped solve the fuel and ammunition problems. Blunden remembered the Seabees' duties. One Japanese bomber dropped its payload close to the airstrip to meet the Seabees on their first day. The work was interrupted, but not stopped. The Seabees leveled and drained the field in 3 weeks. The runway was then paved with recently delivered Marston mat, a 1/8-inch thick steel webbing that was perforated and interlocking to give a flat and stable surface for taxiways, landings, and takeoffs. Planes started to arrive to lend their punch to the conflict as soon as the matting was set up. But it didn't deter the Japanese. The Germans could launch artillery shells from the hills whenever they wanted, while nuisance aircraft known as Washing Machine Willie and Louis and Laos dropped a few bombs on the airfields at night. Although the airfields were not severely damaged by the enemy fire, the Seabees' efforts would be made more difficult. There were roaring applause when Seaman 2C Lawrence Myers shot down a Zero plane, and he retaliated one day by grabbing a nearby Ball 50 caliber machine gun. He would receive the Silver Star for his prompt action. Unfortunately, Myers was killed in action 2 weeks later, thus the honor would be posthumous. The Japanese did everything they could to force the Americans out of business for 3 days in mid-October. On the 13th, just before noon, over 25 Japanese bombers left deep holes and tore up the Marston mat as they pockmarked the field. The Seabees hurried onto the field to fix the damage as the bombers left. To fill in the craters, trucks that had already been loaded and positioned brought loads of rock and gravel. New Marston mat sections that had already been pre-positioned at the runway's edge were used to replace the destroyed ones. Other Seabees collected and cleared sharp steel bits that could pierce airplane tires and shrapnel fragments. Before long, the field was back in use. Following more attacks, the bombing and repairs were carried out twice that afternoon. A Japanese warship then approached near enough to bombard the airstrip with massive 14-inch shells at midnight. Another bomber flight followed the seaborne bombardment. All night long, repairs were made. To keep the airstrip operational, even the cooks helped out. By 9:30 the following morning, the Seabees had completely restored the field via relentless work. Over 3 days, there was a 48-hour cycle of bombing, shelling, and repairs. The field was pocked with 53 craters in total, but the Seabees were up to the challenge despite their fatigue and injuries. Conversely, growing aircraft losses compelled the Japanese to abandon their full-scale assault. The American fighters consistently managed to get into the air during the heavy bombing. Repairing runway damage before the above fighters ran out of gas was the trick. While the Seabees worked as quickly as they could, they occasionally had to circle Henderson Field. We discovered that 100 Seabees could restore the damage of a 500-pound bomb hit on an airstrip in 40 minutes. Blunden subsequently wrote, "The Americans continued to fight after the worst had passed." The 6th NCB constructed 24 miles of road linking Henderson Field, the port, and the 2 new outlying fighter fields, in addition to the urgent task of restoring the main airfield. This involved constructing a number of bridges to cross gullies and creeks. To generate electricity, they repaired a Japanese power plant that they had taken. Additionally, they restored a Japanese ice factory and called it the Tojo Ice Company. The Marines on neighboring Tulagi Island would also get backup from 6th NCB detachments. Of the 4 CB battalions to receive the Presidential Unit citation, the 6th was the first. Additional Marines landed east of Henderson Field in November. They were joined by 500 members of the 14th NCB, who started constructing 2 bomber fields specifically for them. The 26th and 18th NCB arrived in December, relieving the fatigued 6th that had taken the brunt of the Seabees' fight for the island. The Pentagon was persuaded by the Seabees' delayed arrival at Guadalcanal that they should, whenever feasible, land with the invading force so they could start their crucial mission right away. This led to friendly banter between the Seabees and Marines. Both maintained that they were the first to arrive, and in certain instances, such clearing obstacles, the Seabees did arrive before a Marine invasion. There would be taunts directed at the Marines, such as, "What kept you?" The Seabees' recruitment efforts were moved to the selective service system in December 1942. The draft pool was then used for hiring. However, even though the applicants were younger and in better physical condition, their trade skills were lacking. The best on-the-job training would be theirs. The law that established the selective service back in 1940 said, "Any person, regardless of race or color, shall be afforded an opportunity to volunteer for the land and naval forces of the United States." Prior to the war, the few African-American naval personnel were restricted to working as mess attendants in the officers' dining rooms and kitchens. There were thousands of black guys who enlisted when the conflict started. In 1942, the military establishment was still not ready to deploy African Americans to combat troops. To carry out construction tasks, the Navy requested that the Seabees organize these recently enlisted sailors into battalions. Approximately 2,500 black sailors had served in the Seabees by the end of the war. However, concessions had to be made. Since the majority of the black recruits were from the South, it was deemed wise to assign Southern white officers to supervise them. The reasoning behind this was that they would be the most knowledgeable about how to handle the Negroes. However, the Navy learned from experience that this strategy was ineffective, and by 1944, more progressive officials had taken their place. Commendations and promotions ensued. The 34th NCB was the first African-American Seabee unit deployed. They set out for the South Pacific in January 1942. They worked in the Solomon Islands' hot tropical climate for a year and a half. They would soon be discovered by the war. In addition to the deaths from illnesses and accidents, Japanese bombing claimed the lives of 5 men and injured 35 more. The 2nd Black Battalion, the 80th, was being organized and would serve on the island of Trinidad. Around the time the 34th shipped off, others would come after. The Japanese devised a convoluted plan to seize Midway Atoll in June 1942 as the conflict progressed. A subsequent invasion of the Attu and Kiska Islands in the Aleutians was part of it. Alaska was on the front lines all of a sudden. The 4th NCB landed in Alaska within a month to strengthen the defenses of the area. The 21st NCB reinforced them in August. Construction of airports and infrastructure, fuel storage, barracks construction, supply tasks, and assistance to the Army in retaking Attu and Kiska were all part of the effort in Alaska. The 65th NCB touched down close to Freetown, in what is now Sierra Leone, West Africa, in August 1942, by inspiring local laborers and rehabilitating rusting and abandoned equipment. The 65th surprised the smug British colonists. The town became an important supply base, the harbor was restored, and homes, roads, and airfields sprung up. For the Seabees, the invasion of North Africa created a new front. They built barracks, built gun emplacements, improved roads and railroads, unloaded and transported supplies, enlarged airfields and ports, and 1,000 other things under the unrelenting heat of the desert and blowing sand. Basic training standardized along with wartime recruitment. The new Seabees would be trained in light armaments and unit training for 6 weeks. With the Seabee insignia on their uniforms, 5,000 men and almost 8,000 officers would train, construct, and engage in combat. Seabees would get 5 Navy Crosses and 33 Silver Stars for their valor, but the honors would not be free. About 18 officers and 272 men would be killed in action, and another 500 would perish from illnesses or accidents related to construction. There would be a lot more people hurt. Early in the conflict, Seabees had to improvise to complete tasks since they would reach their designated site before their equipment could be transported to them. The lack of operational harbors or docks on undeveloped islands for offloading the supply ships was one major issue. In the South Pacific, there used to be over 80 freighters waiting to be unloaded while swaying at anchor. The majority of the Seabees' food was taken with a supply ship that was sent out for safety after receiving an air raid alarm on Funafuti in the Ellis Islands. One soldier recalled, "We survived for 5 weeks on Vienna sausage and hardtack. When the Germans initially arrived at Guadalcanal, supply ships suddenly departed. Special battalions of Seabee stevedores were established to work solely unloading ships and distributing their contents following the disastrous supply shortages there. When ships were attacked, unloading would not stop. Seabees continued offloading operations while assisting the understaffed sailors in maning the cannons, the infirmaries, and the engine rooms, rather than drawing up anchor and running away at the first hint of difficulty. The Allies started to advance up the Solomon Island chain in the South Pacific. Vangunu Island in the New Georgia Group was on the list. On the morning of June 30th, 1943, the Marines arrived around 10:30, closely followed by the 47th NCB's personnel and gear. The beachhead was sufficiently secure by 3 p.m. for the Seabees to start building a fighter airfield. The first jet landed 9 days after the hills had been blasted and destroyed, the ravines leveled, filled in, and paved with crushed coral. By July 18th, a whole fighter squadron was able to use a 3,300-foot runway. The Vangunu runway was expanded in August. Bombers flying north from Guadalcanal could have a fighter escort on their bombing flights thanks to the construction of support facilities and revetments, as well as the installation of 2 enormous aircraft fuel tanks nearby. The Seabees were required anywhere American forces were stationed, not just in the Pacific. A ring of bases was established to guard the Panama Canal because it was a highly crucial position in a 2-ocean conflict. This included enlarging already existing facilities in Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Canal Zone. Arrangements were reached with the British over Lend-Lease territory in the Caribbean and with nations in Central America. By 1943, the fast-growing Seabee program allowed them to replace the civilian workers that had done much of the early work. In late 1943, the 87th NCB returned to the Solomons to support combat troops from New Zealand and was tasked with the invasion of the Treasury Islands. Machinist's mate 2C Aurelio Tassone was informed that a Japanese pillbox was obstructing the Kiwis' advance while he was bringing his bulldozer ashore to start work. He was then asked whether he could strike the pillbox with his dozer. He raised the blade of the dozer to protect himself from rifle fire as he swung behind the hostile position. Upon arriving at the opposing position, he buried a dozen Japanese soldiers by lowering the stove and blade into the barrier of sand and palm log. Tassone received the Silver Star for his actions. Additionally, he served as the inspiration for a sequence in the 1944 film The Fighting Sea Beeson, in which John Wayne, then 37, played out Tassone's valiant actions. Back home, the Seabees invented something that would change the course of the war. By using standardized watertight boxes, they enhanced an antiquated instrument known as the pontoon bridge. Pontoons were made of welded plate steel and measured 5 by 70 by 5. Captain John Laycock of the Civil Engineering Corps, CEC, spearheaded this endeavor. Even prior to Pearl Harbor, he had a functional model of his 20-ton supporting pontoon ready for testing. Bridges, piers, wharves, causeways, tiny dry docks, and barges would all be covered by this system. One of these robust pontoon barges was also utilized as an icebreaker in Alaska. The pontoons would be dragged ashore and used for griddles and bake ovens, among other things. Standardizing the components and fasteners, referred to as jewels, that connected the floating boxes allowed for a variety of configurations. Operations Husky, the invasion of Sicily in July 1943, would be the first test of the new system. The shallow waters surrounding the beaches in southern Sicily made it impossible for tanks or bulldozers to land, since LSTs, landing ship tank, could touch down up to 500 feet away while still being 6 feet underwater. A 300-foot pontoon causeway was the answer, bringing the large machinery within 200 feet of the shore, within wading distance. The landing went smoothly thanks to top-secret rehearsals. These causeways, which were transported in segments by LSTs, totaled 96 deployments. Over 1,000 trucks, tanks, weapons, and heavy vehicles would be offloaded. The enemy was completely unprepared for amphibious landings in southern Sicily, which they believed were impossible. Miraculous is how British commander Lord Louis Mountbatten described the causeways. The Seabees lost the element of surprise. The Germans were not duped twice when they attempted to duplicate their Sicilian success at Salerno and Anzio on the Italian coast. They went after the helpless Seabees who rode the causeways to shore. The Seabees continued to deliver supplies and ammunition along the causeways while under fire when determined counterattacks threatened the beachhead at Anzio. They suffered additional casualties while unloading the supply ships, which stabilized the Allied positions and sparked a breakout that ultimately succeeded in capturing Rome. After learning from North Africa, Sicily, and Italy, the Seabees focused on Operation Overlord, the June 1944 landings in Normandy, France, which was the largest technical challenge of the war, if not of history. The necessary causeways and piers had already been perfected by the Navy builders. However, there would be fresh difficulties. In the spring, the Normandy coast is frequently stormy, and 1944 was no different. The Seabees were keen to construct harbors and breakwaters because they were lacking along the coast. The Mulberry Harbor, a British invention, was the answer. In order to create a breakwater that would calm the sea sufficiently to permit the unloading of supplies over the now familiar pontoon causeways, Churchill's plan was to build hollow blocks of cement caissons, known as phoenixes, that could be towed across the channel and sunk side by side with available block ships. The American landing site at Omaha Beach and the British landing site at Gold Beach would both be served by the British-built caissons. The Seabees were tasked with building the American Mulberry Port. At Omaha Beach, some 50 of the phoenixes were employed to build a mulberry harbor that was 2 miles long. British tugboats eased each Phoenix into position. The Omaha Mulberry took almost a week to finish, starting on D-Day. The erratic shoreline at Normandy, which curved in underwater ripples of sandbars parallel to the beach, was another issue. These ripples might trap big landing boats, LSTs, far offshore. Barges made of linked pontoons that were 30 boxes long and 6 boxes wide were the answer, which was based on the pontoon system. The Rhino ferry was the name of it. In deep water, the Rhinos would dock with an LST. 2 massive outboard engines would then propel the barge to the shore, after the ship transferred half of its cargo, at a time, onto the ferry. The barges would return for the second half of the LST's load after unloading. The Rhinos were to be built, tested, and operated by the 81st and 111th NCBs, who had previously worked on the Italian landings. 11 Rhinos would be deployed in the initial waves at Omaha Beach on D-Day, with the goal of increasing to 20 as quickly as feasible. 11 more would be used at Utah Beach. LSTs started dragging the Rhinos away from British ports and toward France on June 5th. It took all night, and the going was slow on the rough seas. They wouldn't be in place until 5:30 a.m. The swells off Normandy that day were 6 feet and more, but the Rhinos were built to work in waters with swells of 3 feet. Lashing and securing the Rhinos to the front of their LSTs was a risky task. As Seabees and machine operators started loading 75 to 80 trucks, tanks, and bulldozers onto the barges in the surging swells, accidents hampered progress. To the relief of everyone on board, it took until midday for the first of the ferries to arrive at Utah Beach, despite the assistance of tugboats and small landing craft pushing from astern. Meanwhile, the Rhinos were halted at Omaha before they could make it to the coast. In addition to sunken and disabled landing craft, German barriers made of steel, concrete, and mines stood in their path. On D-Day, only one Rhino, piloted by Lieutenant Robert Stilgenbauer, made it to land because he didn't notice the stop signal. He somehow managed to get to the beach and unload his belongings, but by the time he finished unloading the large trucks, the tide had gone out, leaving him trapped on the shore until it came back. It would take until D-Day +1 for any other Rhino to land at Omaha. Army Corps of Engineers personnel and Seabees from Naval Combat Demolition Units were the first Allied troops to land before Stilgenbauer. These men were skilled demolition professionals who removed the barriers as quickly as possible in the waning light before dawn. They came under heavy fire and were wounded when they were discovered by vigilant German sentries. Nevertheless, they destroyed enough of the barriers to allow the landing craft to access the beaches. About 1,000 additional soldiers from Naval Construction Regiment 25, 25th NCR, a temporary combination of many battalions, were erecting causeways and piers at Utah and Omaha beaches, while Seabees were tearing down impediments on land and grappling with Rhinos at sea. These causeways would eventually transport millions of tons of supplies and equipment of all kinds to the ravenous Allied armies until November 1944, when the Germans were forced to relinquish control of the French and Dutch ports, even though the Rhinos carried in the initial wave of heavy vehicles. After that, the Seabees were sent to clear the way and fix those port infrastructures. The seashore was the Seabees' domain, and they were excellent at assisting and supplying the Army and Marines there. One significant exception existed. Detachments of the 627th, 628th, and 629th Construction Battalion Maintenance Units, CBMU, were ready with small boats, 300 total, construction equipment, and the ubiquitous pontoons to transport the soldiers, tanks, and supplies across the powerful Rhine River when General George S. Patton's Third Army arrived. Patton requested that the CBMUs wear Army uniforms to avoid being mistaken for the enemy. The Seabees went above and above the call of duty throughout the war. As long as the food was available, Seabee cooks at Guadalcanal fed any Marine who approached them. Throughout the war, feeding every sailor, Marine, soldier, or airman who asked acquired a sense of honor for the Seabees. One cook, a chef prior to the war, persuaded the Navy to purchase a whole herd of native cattle in the Russell Islands, north of Guadalcanal. He ran a hamburger restaurant, processing the beef and making his own buns, and served his Seabees and the island's larger Air Corps population, all for free. On June 15th, the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions touched down on Saipan as the Army was still having difficulties on the Normandy beaches. Alongside them, the 18th and 121st NCBs landed. The Seabees quickly filled in bomb holes, cleared trash and shrapnel, and smoothed over the mile-long runway when the Marines took control of Aslito Airfield on June 19th. 2 days later, the first American jet was able to land there. The Seabees did more at Saipan than anywhere else. From the shore to the airport was a small demolished Japanese railroad. While the locomotive and wagons were being repaired, the construction workers replaced the track and rail bed that had been bombed away. After 4 days of work, the train, much to the relief of the troops who would otherwise have had to carry it by hand, transported everything from fuel to bombs from the landing site to the airstrip. Guam was the next American target. The 1st Marine Brigade and the 3rd Marine Division waded ashore on July 21st, with the 25th NCB following closely behind. The Seabees got right to work unloading, sorting, and transporting the cargo to the designated units across the beach. The 2nd Special Battalion supported the 25th for specialized jobs like stevedores, demolition, ordnance clearance, road construction, lumberjacking and milling, machine repair, maintenance, and more. The Seabees had developed a number of these specials. The 2nd was chosen from among dock workers and stevedores, who were skilled at quickly loading and unloading cargo. Seabees helped unload LSTs that were trapped on a reef at a second landing location on Guam while operating a waterproof tractor. Then, under fire, they maneuvered tanks through the shallowest water to shore. The single natural harbor on the island, Opera Harbor, was being improved by Seabees by the end of the first week of the assault. They intensified their efforts to turn Opera into a first-class harbor, even though a storm in October damaged all of their hard work. 3 miles south of Saipan, the neighboring island of Tinian was then invaded. Tinian had just one beach, and it was well guarded. The remainder of the island was made up of natural barriers like bogs and rocks. The enemy didn't consider the Seabees when they viewed the 15-foot cliffs on Tinian's north shore as insurmountable. The 6th Construction Brigade was commanded by civil engineer Captain Paul Halloran, who created a unique system for an LVT, landing vehicle tracked, that carried a ramp with cross ties. The LVTs, also known as doodlebugs, rolled over the cliffs to the top, after dropping their ramps against them as they approached the shore. The 4th Marines clambered over the northern bluffs and outflanked the Japanese, who were waiting in the south. By August 1st, the assault of July 24th was over. The Seabees were quite nervous. Seabees could be seen charting and surveying areas still controlled by the enemy in the middle of multiple fights. They were instructed not to use dynamite near the front lines on Guadalcanal since it interfered with artillery piece target alignment. A crew commanded by Captain Halloran surveyed a potential runway location on Tinian. Several Marine tanks were aiming their guns at them, and one of the Seabees saw it. The officer went to look into it, but a tank officer instructed him to leave and return in a few hours because they hadn't yet taken that land. More jokes regarding who got there first resulted from the circumstance. Following the evacuation of the enemy, the Seabees proceeded to construct the world's largest airport. It was necessary to cut and fill, level and scrape, surface and maintain 6 different runways. Each one was a city block wide and at least 1.5 miles long. 2 10-hour shifts of 200 dump trucks operated 20 hours a day, with 4 hours of maintenance in between. The airfields were constructed to handle the massive Boeing B-29 Superfortress bombers that were coming to destroy Japan. For 4,000 men, 15,000 of them were Seabees. The Seabees constructed housing, kitchens, hospitals, water storage, fuel and ammunition dumps, and sanitary facilities. They designed a street grid for Tinian, based on the Manhattan grid, possibly for their own enjoyment. There were even streets named after their Manhattan counterparts, including Central Park, an ammo dump in the middle of the island. Many of these New York street names are still used in Tinian today. Some of the crews of the B-29s flying from the island began to develop a symbiotic relationship with the Seabees. The Seabees took these airmen under their wing, and some of the crews named their aircraft after the Seabees. When they returned from a mission, they were given ice cream, better bedding, preferential housing, and other favors. Like in Europe, the Seabees played a key role in the success of the Army-sponsored landings at the Leyte Gulf in the Philippines. On October 20th, the 6th Army thundered ashore. Although they were not required, the Seabees were ready to provide them with landing boats and pontoon causeways. The sandy shore and protected gulf made it ideal for the big LSTs to land on the beach. The Seabees began unloading the LSTs and dispersing the vehicles, equipment, and supplies that were carried in their hulls about 1 hour after the initial landings. Soon, additional tasks would require the construction battalions. Admiral William Halsey left the Army without fighter protection on the night of the 24th when he steamrolled his entire Third Fleet northward to intercept incoming Japanese aircraft carriers. To safeguard the troops who were in danger, the 61st NCB and Army engineers hurried to finish the fighter and bomber fields. Approximately 32,000 Seabees participated in the Lady Samar assault. A total of 100 Japanese air attacks were launched against their shore facilities and construction projects. Japanese soldiers once parachuted onto a Samar airfield construction site. They were repelled by the Seabees until Army forces could get there. The 119th NCB constructed a camp and hospital for 4,000 freed American prisoners of war close to Manila. Many had been mistreated and were undernourished. They were housed, nourished, and had their illnesses and wounds treated in the camp until they could be sent home. The rocky outcrop of Iwo Jima is located halfway between Japan and Tinian. With the help of the 133rd NCB, which had 767 soldiers and 23 officers, the 4th Marine Division was to lead the attack on the little island. The battle plans called for a 3-day campaign. 29 days would pass. 20 minutes after the first wave of Marine attack, on February 19, 1945, the Seabees touched down on the beach. Originally employed as a shore party, the construction battalion transported supplies and weapons to the front. Wheeled vehicles couldn't be supported by the beach's soft sands, therefore tanks and bulldozers were used to move trucks to the solid land behind the beach sand, while being fired at by enemy snipers and artillery. In order for trucks to traverse the perilous dunes, Marston mats were spread out as they were brought ashore. The 133rd NCB's primary responsibility was to maintain and improve the island's central Motoyama airstrip. The 133rd suffered 328 losses, including 42 killed and 2 missing, by the time the airfield was secured. Therefore, the mission had to be redistributed to the 31st and 62nd NCBs. It would be the most casualties ever sustained by a Seabee unit. Seabees were constructing housing for the Army Air Forces, constructing or renovating harbor facilities, and delivering the mountains of supplies, food, fuel, ammunition, building materials, and equipment required for all parties, Marines, Seabees, and Army Air Forces, ashore while the fighting continued. Even before the battle on the island ended, the Seabees, who frequently worked under fire, managed to get the airfield ready for crippled B-29s coming from Japan. In order to provide fighter defense for the massive bombers flying from Tinian as they approached their targets, 2 fighter fields were soon built as well. Speaking about the 3 airfields, Admiral Halsey told reporters during a news conference that the Seabees on Iwo Jima would build another island and put 4 or 5 airfields there if necessary. The Seabees' most challenging assignment in the Pacific was Okinawa. The 10th Army and a Marine Corps were given the task of launching the island invasion. An initial deployment of 16,000 Army engineers and Seabees would provide support. Under the leadership of Commodore Andrew G. Bissett, Seabee battalions were arranged into 4 brigades and 11 regiments. Among his command were the U.S. Army and even a few engineers from Britain. When the island was safe, he would supervise 95,000 construction workers. During the war, it was the biggest assembly of builders for a single combat. At this stage, amphibious landings had been practiced extensively. Segments of 25 separate pontoon causeways were laid down between the coral reef and the shore, and were subsequently hauled by LSTs following a severe naval and air bombardment. In order to serve as shore parties and unload the massive amount of equipment required to support the combat troops, 3 Seabee battalions landed. While other Seabees cleared obstructions and mines, the Seabees and the Corps of Engineers took control of the first airport the Army had taken, and by D-Day, Ploetz III, it was operational. Before the terrain was conquered, surveyors frequently went out and ahead of the combat soldiers and found locations for barracks, fuel storage, and other facilities. The Seabees established the island as the primary base for the planned invasion of Japan once it was safe to do so. Prior to the Japanese surrender, airfields that could accommodate 4,000 fighter, bomber, cargo, and reconnaissance aircraft were still under construction. The builders were unfazed. On Okinawa, they completed their tasks, but they weren't finished yet. Following the end of hostilities, Seabees were among the first Americans to set foot in Japan. Damage was removed, and barracks, kitchens, and mess halls were constructed for the occupying forces that would arrive later. The Navy was adamant on keeping the Seabees as an equal branch because they had contributed so much to the war effort. The Seabees have an incredibly impressive record. The Seabees constructed 111 major airstrips of 441 piers, 2,558 ammunition magazines, 700 square blocks of warehouses, hospitals to serve 7,000 patients, tanks for the storage of 1,000 gallons of gasoline, and housing for 15,000 men throughout the Pacific Theater, according to an exhibit at the Seabees Museum in Port Hueneme, California. Additionally, it should be mentioned that the Pacific Seabees received over 2,000 Purple Heart medals and over 200 battle deaths. The Seabees still operate many of the buildings they constructed over 70 years ago. For instance, the primary airport in Solomon Islands, Honiara International Airport, was formerly Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. The Seabees continue to serve today, sending troops to areas affected by natural catastrophes and war. Seabees were sent to Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands after the 2017 hurricanes to help with cleanup, food and water delivery, and reconstruction. They keep up their dedication to the Navy and the country,